This presentation is titled AI-related use cases of AWS EC2. So to begin with a presentation overview, I'll be describing how we can make use of and introduce cloud computing resources that are offered in AWS and how the EC2 instance can be used. And we'll be describing several algorithms which can be deployed over the cloud in such an instance. And then we'll close out by providing an overview of how the EC2 environment and the EC2 ecosystem can be helpful for discussing the different output of several algorithms and related functionalities of the AWS system. And this is so that we can determine how we can make use of cloud computing in general, not only within AWS, but even within other relating cloud platforms to facilitate future numerical experiments or tests for different parts of algorithms that can be useful. So we'll first want to begin by describing some overall background about the EC2 instance, in which it's a cloud computing resource for interfacing between Linux instances and the AWS ecosystem. And it's really convenient to make use of this EC2 instance and this connection with the AWS cloud computing environment through a Windows 10 operating system. And in particular, the instance itself requires uploading files to an AWS file manager, and one can either access the cloud, access the system in the cloud from another GPU or through the command line itself, in which the command line interface directly allows for someone to directly deposit or transfer files between different directories of the instance. And this also allows us to have access to the cloud command line for executing, for example, Python scripts or more complicated processes across several languages through the sidejoin in the Ubuntu terminals. So we first have to make use of some information through an identification and being able to establish a secure connection to the AWS EC2 ecosystem in the instance through the sidejoin terminal. And then embedded within the sidejoin terminal is an Ubuntu terminal that allows us to further perform any other code related and processing tasks for the type of algorithm and data that we're interested in looking at. And in particular, also with a general purpose instance, it's possible to scale up automation and related processes with reliable compute. So this is why the EC2 instance can be useful for a variety of different algorithms. And the three particular algorithms that I'm going to focus on are the quantum algorithm, transcriptomics algorithms, and genomics algorithms. And also at the end, when we discuss how the EC2 instance can be used in each circumstance and how we can make use of the EC2 instance for these types of pipelines, there exists many other potential possibilities for cloud computation and cloud computing in these areas and nearby areas. So we can first begin by describing the variational quantum algorithm. And broadly speaking, there can be many ways in which one can look at what is the field of artificial intelligence or machine learning these days. And we're going to adopt a pretty liberal or broad-minded approach so that that can help us have an idea about how these different algorithms make use of different processing steps and how they relate in one way or another or in their own intrinsic ways to machine learning and artificial intelligence. So in the case of this variational quantum algorithm, there's a similarity with the machine learning algorithms that are deployed to the cloud, which include the following three items. First of all, we have to make use of optimization, which determines the runtime of the algorithm, which is related to the runtime that a classical PDE solver would have to use for approximating solutions at each instance of time. As well as in the second item, we have to make use of a data structure, which determines how the algorithm processes new information generated for the solution at each time step of the evolution. And in the third item, we also have to keep in mind that visualization is also very important of several AI-related algorithms and also with this variational quantum algorithm, because it helps us determine how the curvature and derivatives of different solutions to PDEs can change with respect to each instance or each numerical experiment that we run and overall the runtime of the algorithm. And this is just to say that my talk and my interest in variational quantum algorithms, it's been, I've spoken about this topic before in terms of APS April 2022 meeting, a seminar at the Dartmouth applied math department, as well as another related talk in the APS March 2023 meeting. And across each one of these talks, I've been able to emphasize different parts of the algorithms and of this variational quantum algorithm and how it relates to classical algorithms and even other types of algorithms in areas that may seem to not have much of a connection. For one, in the first presentation that's on the leftmost side, I just described generally implementing the algorithm for a few PDEs. And then in the Dartmouth seminar talk, I gave some more attention to the actual ansatz, which is the initial state of the construction, as well as the fact that this quantum algorithm can have polynomial runtime. And then in the most recent APS talk that I gave earlier this year, I talked about resemblance with the variational quantum eigensolver, which is just relating to eigenvalue and eigenvalue problems and how solving differential equations and partial differential equations or ordinary differential equations can be related to eigenvalue problems, which shares connection with numerical linear algebra and several other types of algorithms. So it's just to go to show that even though this variational quantum algorithm under some more strict interpretation of what AI really is, may not really be an AI-centric algorithm, it still shares many connections with optimization and how machine learning performs classification into binary or even more complicated classifications depending upon the optimization step, and how this can also relate to potential other families of algorithms which could exhibit polynomial, quadratic, or exponential speedups from what we've been doing classically forever. So to implement the VQA, broadly speaking, the steps of the algorithm consist of pre-processing of the initial data from an ansatz or an initial condition imposed on the solution state before we perform the time evolution. And in the second step, compiling the quantum and classic algorithms together through a feedback loop for updating the solution array. And finally, in the third item, reiterating the previous two steps above, in which we interface quantum computation and classical computation for determining how many time steps the quantum simulation is ran for. So this is just pretty much reiterating on my summary of different aspects of this particular algorithm that I gave in my previous three presentations I mentioned. So one is that we can think about why would we want to make use of an AWS EC2 instance for this variational quantum algorithm, and what would be helpful for it, or what it would be helpful for it. So one thing is that, we can try to look at how the algorithm would perform on our limited compute and determine whether scaling it up to more generous or more abundant computational resources would be of use. And in particular, for one of the partial differential equations I was interested in looking at this variational quantum algorithm for, I was first looking at some solutions that I could generate for a smaller, more restrictive number of time steps, and determining and thinking to myself about how making use of an AWS EC2 compute would help me determine more complicated behaviors in which different nonlinearities of the partial differential equation solution would come into play. And this is very much still an interest for people who work in classical and quantum algorithms alike, namely determining whether there are any edge cases or more complicated cases of some type of algorithm or some type of initial data that's passed to the algorithm that would be of interest to run in a cloud computing environment. And we can see that even from the simpler case of the solution for one particular instance of the solution that I was able to obtain from the variational quantum algorithm, that from the particle swarm optimizer, all of the points in the time evolution, there can be some differences in how the algorithm is able to handle or process the nonlinearities of a given partial differential equation, in which one can see that around time step 40, as well as around time step 350, there can be some differences, and even between time steps 200 and 300, there can be some differences in how the algorithm can predict the magnitude of the nonlinearity in this type of sinusoidal motion that I was able to approximate for the Kamasa-Holm equations, which is related to some type of wave propagation from a certain class of initial data that I passed to the partial differential equation. And this is just to say that from the interest and the motivation that we've had in continuing to scale up different algorithms that we can deploy to the cloud and look to make use of an AWS EC2 compute, we can further automate the numerical experiments for the variational quantum algorithm over the cloud with EC2 for studying more complicated nonlinearities of the PDE. So if we look at all of these all these simulation plots that I have in the slide for approximations of solutions to this partial differential equation for the Kamasa-Holm equation, we can see that the AWS EC2 instance is able to help us in at least facilitating the deployment of this process to the cloud, but also being able to more efficiently allow for us to experiment with more complicated nonlinearities and initial conditions from the limited compute that we have, which can just be a great alternative instead of having to necessarily get one's own type of hardware or workstation for running these types of simulations. And there can be there can be many different ways in which the nonlinearities of the Kamasa-Holm partial differential equation can interface with one another. You can see that in the leftmost side here for a simulation that we ran for 4,500 time steps, that depending on the initial condition, we can interface one simulation run to have a very strong or high initial condition for the initial value of the wave at the beginning of the time step evolution, and that if we run it for around 3,000 time steps before completing the simulation at the full 4,500 time steps, that there can be quite a sizable or quite a large fluctuation from the initial condition that we initially pass to the solution state. But this is for the blue solution. For the solution that's given in the other color, we pass it a much smaller initial condition at the beginning of the time evolution, which would result in there being much less fluctuations. And on top of that, there being a much smaller magnitude of the fluctuations themselves. And by and large, this observation holds for many of the other types of simulations that we were able to run over the cloud and get results for different types of optimizers, different time steps of the optimizers, as well as different initial conditions for the solutions that we're interested in examining further. But the use of the AWS EC2 instance in this case doesn't just stop here. We can also look for the Einstein equations, which is a very well-known set or system of partial differential equations, which can also be used to predict and numerically quantify the effects of gravitational pull and different tidal forces in various space-time geometries, given different forms of the energy stress tensor, which Einstein denoted as T mu nu in his equations. And then we can see that as we vary the number of time steps, this case for 500, we're able to make use of the AWS EC2 compute as a cloud resource, again, for handling more complicated nonlinearities in a completely different area, rather than how waves propagate and how waves can potentially stabilize in time. In this case, we can see that given different simulation test cases from the stress energy tensor, either into scalar field, electromagnetic field, or magnetic field components, we can look at different ways in which the gravitational pull on different types of objects would either decrease with respect to the time step of the evolution. So if the object has some trajectory in a magnetic field or in a gravitational field, how would introducing different components to the gravitational field allow for us to account for how the gravitational force that's exerted on this object would change with respect to different locations of the space-time. And this is just also to show and continue advertising that there's a preprint that I have, the latest version of which is from November of last year, which talks about these types of simulations, in which I go into much more detail about the cost function that's used for the optimization step, as well as plotting hundreds of solutions are generated from many different classes of initial conditions for 15 partial differential equations. And another example of making use of the AWS EC2 compute, this time for transcriptomics. So in comparison to the cloud deployment of the quantum algorithm we described in the previous example, there can exist room for also making use of this AWS ecosystem in the file system, in the EC2 instance, and the general purpose EC2 instance for transcriptomics and genomics pipelines alike. And these pipelines typically rely on RNA or DNA sequencing input, either on the bulk or single cell level, which also entails teasing apart hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of transcripts apart from one another when producing the FASTA output containing novel genetic targets, as well as finally possibly performing additional downstream processing of genetic sequences with NCBI command lines. And this is just to give a workflow of a different class of algorithm, which can be obviously completely different and quite separate for the variational quantum algorithm that we first applied that we first deployed over the cloud. In the case of this transcriptomics pipeline that we deployed over the cloud, we have to, as our first step, make use of some sequencing resource, as well as then proceeding to a second stage chrysalis, in which different contigs are formed and Debrugian graphs are constructed. And then finally, in the third step, there's, after several processing steps, including bow tie and alignment and related processes of genetic sequences that are generated that can be teased apart from the Debrugian graphs that are given in the second step in chrysalis. In the third step in butterfly, we have a transcript assembly into a multifaceted file. And then finally, as I alluded to in the last item in the previous slide, the fourth step can consist of either performing T-BLAST or other basic local alignment search tools for isolating potential gene candidates from generated transcripts, which can inform assay development for future experimental investigation. And the AWS file manager outputs the FASTA output containing on the order of hundreds of thousands of genetic sequences. So we can see from whatever is contained in the FASTA output, it'll contain hundreds of thousands, or maybe if the RNA sequencing is complicated and extensive enough, millions of generated sequences, which Trinity has, each of which has their own length, and the sequence is directly output below this identifier with the length in the FASTA file. And the final application of EC2 compute is a gene prediction pipelines. This gene prediction pipeline through Augustus shares some similarities in the Trinity transcriptome assembly pipeline that we looked at, in that we're able to further scale up our deployment of this algorithm to the cloud in comparison to less extensive computational resources that we have, through a workstation or a laptop for generating different types of genes, which could be of interest. And for Augustus, it's important to determine which reference genome should be used. So for this algorithm and many other genomics-related algorithms, they have some type of reference genome or some type of either reference data set, which is used by the algorithm to help the algorithm form its predictions in a more consistent manner from sequencing of different genomes that has already been gathered. And the output format is also similar to what the AWS file manager outputs in FASTA from the Trinity transcriptomics assembly pipeline, which I described in the previous use case for AWS EC2. So for conclusions, we know that AWS is a powerful resource for scaling up or testing a wide variety of classical algorithms and quantum algorithms as well. And for Linux instances, the AWS EC2 environment allows for quick testing, debugging, and iteration on a wide variety of algorithms, but still at the same time, many future opportunities exist that are of interest for other algorithms, either for continuing to test up or to scale up simulations for testing them more, testing limits of computation, or for more close comparisons with experiment. And thanks for watching.